chapter which the Imam is entitled Babu Ma Ja'a min Taqlidi fi man abada Allah inda qabri rajulin salih fa kayfa idha abada. The condemnation of the one who worships Allah at a grave of a righteous person. So what would be the condemnation of the person who worships the buried man himself? And in that chapter we read a number of hadith. The first one was a hadith of Aisha, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said about the people who built places of worship over graves, and they placed in those places of worship graven images. He said, "Ulaika shira'ul khalq indallah." He said, these people are the worst of creation in the sight of Allah. The second hadith we read was the hadith of Aisha also, in which the Prophet said, "La'natullahi ala al-Yahudi wal-Nasara ittakhadhu qubur anbiya'ihim masajid yuhadhdhir mimma sana'u." He said, may the curse of Allah be upon the Jews and Christians who took the graves of the prophets as places of worship, discouraging people from doing what they did. The next hadith was the hadith of Jundub ibn Abdullah, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Ala wa inni." He said, "Ala wa inna man qablakum kanu yattakhiduna qubur anbiya'ihim masajid. Ala fala tattakhidhu al-qabr." I'm sorry. "Ala fala tattakhidhu al-qubur masajida fa inni anhaakum an dhalik." So he said in this hadith, he said, certainly the people before you, they took the graves of their prophets as places of worship. He said, I certainly prohibit you. He said, so therefore do not take graves as houses of worship or places of worship, for I forbid you from doing so. So I just want to mention a few points that we should take away from this chapter. There were a number of things that were mentioned. So first of all, one of the things we can take away from this chapter, and the titling of the chapter, is the concept of al-qiyas al-awlawi. Al-qiyas al-awlawi basically means that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, if they prohibit something which is of a lesser degree in terms of severity, by default, anything greater than that is also prohibited. And the Imam is applying that principle here. He mentions a number of a hadith where the Prophet prohibited worshipping Allah at the grave of a righteous person. If that's prohibited, by default, worshipping the righteous person is what? Is prohibited. You guys follow that? Everybody see that? Does that make sense? That if you can't worship Allah at the grave of a righteous person, you certainly can't worship the righteous person. Min babi awla, right? That's what they call qiyas al-awlawi. So that's one thing we can take away from the chapter. The second thing that we can take away is the reason why the Prophet's grave was not in a place where people could go up to it, like walk up to it. It was not in an open space. That basically it was enclosed, right? And people were prohibited from actually visiting his grave directly. One of the reasons was because he did not want his grave to be taken as a mosque, as a place where people offer worship. Okay. Another thing that we benefit is that the Prophet ﷺ was keen to block every avenue that could lead to haram in general, and he was keen to block every avenue that could lead to shirk, idolatry specifically. So notice he prohibited people from taking the Prophet's graves as places where they worship. He did that because he didn't want ultimately people to worship what? Those righteous people, or to worship those prophets. So the Prophet, rather than just prohibit the wrong thing, he prohibited the things that could what? Ultimately lead to that. And he was keen to do that. We're going to see that a lot in this book, and as it relates to what? A tawheed. The Prophet will prohibit something, not because it itself is haram in of itself, but because it can lead to what? Lead to haram. Another thing that we benefit is what it means to take a grave as a place of worship. It means that you offer an act of worship, any act of worship at what? At the grave, right? So It doesn't mean that you have to build a building and call it a mosque. It just simply means that you offer an act of worship in the what? In the same space where the grave exists. Y'all see that? So if a person went to the cemetery and did what? And started praying. Even if he faced the qibla, he didn't face the grave. He's taking what? He's taking that grave as a masjid. If he went there and made what? Dua, other than the dua for what? Al-mayyit. Right? Or he went there and he made a nadhr. He made an oath. He made an oath or a vow. Or he went there and he took a sheep with him. He did what? He slaughtered that sheep. We'd say he what? He took that grave as a place of worship. We also learned that doing an act of worship in the vicinity of a grave, that this is something which is a major sin. Why? Because the Prophet said, he cursed the Jews and Christians for doing that. And Allah and His Messenger don't curse anyone except for doing a major sin. You guys see that? Not just any ordinary regular sin, but a major sin. It is prohibited, and the scholars are agreed, to offer an act of worship at a grave. It's prohibited. To offer the salat that we just made like that, to offer that at a grave is prohibited. The only exception would be salat al-janazah. Salat al-janazah, that would be the only exception. And the other exception obviously would be dua for what? Al-mayyit. Y'all see that? What if a person prayed in the vicinity of what? Of a grave, and he didn't realize that there was a grave, and he didn't intend the grave, he just intended to what? To make prayer. The scholars of Islam differ about what? About the validity of that prayer. Is that prayer valid or invalid? But we know that a person should not do that. They should not do that, and that's because the Prophet ﷺ said, "La tusalli ila al-qubur, wa la tajlis alayha." He said, don't pray in the direction of a grave, and don't what? And don't sit upon them. Y'all see that? Okay? So the scholars of Islam differ about whether or not that prayer is accepted, but they all agree that you shouldn't do it. Y'all see that? You shouldn't do it. طيب ممتاز. Also, if you have a grave and then a mosque is built on that grave, the mosque has to be demolished. And if you have a mosque and then a grave is placed in that mosque, the grave has to be what? The grave has to be removed. Whichever one came first, the other one must be removed. You see, or demolished. Y'all see that? Another thing that we wanted to talk about is something that was mentioned the other night. One of the brothers, they mentioned that there is a mosque in Hebron. And he said that mosque is called Masjid al-Khalil. The Masjid of the Khalil, Ibrahim alayhi salam. And they say that he's buried there. He's buried underneath that mosque. They also say that his wife Sarah is buried there. They also say Yaqub is buried there. They say that Yusuf is buried there, and a few other people are buried there. And so he asked about this mosque. And the first thing I want to say is that the scholars of Islam are in agreement that the only grave that is confirmed and known for a prophet, the place of it is known, and it's known with tawatur, it's known by a chain, which is, there's so many chains of it, there's so much information concerning it that it can't be disputed. The only existence of a grave of a prophet that can be confirmed is that of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, and that of what? Ibrahim. Okay? That of Ibrahim. So this Masjid Ibrahim, apparently Abraham is buried there or buried near there. Okay? But as far as all these other claims, that this is the grave of Yunus, this is the grave of Shu'aib, and this is the grave of Fulan, this is the grave of Alan from the prophets, none of those are confirmed. And anyone who says that X-prophet is buried here and X-prophet is buried there, that person is not telling the truth. He's not being honest. And there's no way for him to confirm that. The second thing is that irregardless of whether we could confirm or we couldn't confirm that a prophet is buried in a particular place, what the prophet said applies. That we can't take the houses of the graves of the prophets as houses of worship or places where we worship. Okay? And so if in fact Abraham is actually buried underneath this mosque, then we shouldn't offer prayer there. We shouldn't offer prayer there because what we said, that the scholars are agreed that prayer in the place where a grave is prohibited. Whether it's accepted or not, depending on your intention, are you praying to the grave, or you just happen to be praying and it's in the grave? There's a difference of opinion about that. The last thing is this debate about the Prophet's mosque. Because if somebody would say, okay, well, doesn't the Prophet's mosque now, due to expansion, doesn't it contain the grave of the Prophet ﷺ? Doesn't it contain that grave? And so if it does, if we accept that, if we accept that, then shouldn't the prayer in the Prophet's mosque also be prohibited by necessity? Y'all see that? This is the debate, okay? And there's a lot to be said about that to provide clarity and to answer that question with some degree of thoroughness. And so I'm going to save that for tomorrow. All right, I'm going to save that discussion for tomorrow. We'll discuss that only tomorrow. And then we'll be finished with this chapter. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. We'll talk specifically about the Prophet's mosque. And is the Prophet's, because there's a debate among scholars, is the Prophet's grave in the mosque or is it outside of the mosque? That's the first debate. And if we accept that it's inside the mosque, how can we offer prayer there? What's the answer to that question? Those two questions, inshallah, we'll look at those tomorrow. I want to say before we close out, though, that the weather is supposed to get pretty severe tonight into tomorrow. So I ask everybody to be very, very careful, be safe. Make sure you have your provisions. Just in case, because the way that they're putting it, we may be snowed in. Also, be in touch with each other. Some people may be in a situation where their power goes out, and so let's be there for each other and support each other and be available. Somebody gives you a call, don't let it go to voicemail, that type of thing. All right, let's look out for each other. Let's get through this together. May Allah keep us all safe. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our community. Hadha wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa jazakumullahu khairan.
What he's going to do? He's going to disconnect. I don't know how to
Send you straight to voicemail. Naim.
So,
Naim.
learning from this lesson, from this chapter, is we cannot build a mosque where there is already a graveyard. Number two is we cannot bury somebody when already there is a mosque there. So I have seen back there in overseas, like some people when they die, and Muslim brothers die.
Go ahead, Naim.
They bury him in front of the either masjid